July soon returned to work, but his demeanor had not greatly improved. He had little humor in him, and could not be teased successfully, which was an irritant to Clara. She had always loved to tease, and considered it an irony of her life that she was so often drawn to men who didn't recognize teasing, even when she was inflicting it on them. Bob had never responded to teasing or even noticed it, and her powers in that line had slowly rusted from lack of practice. Of course, she teased the girls, but it was not the same as having a grown man to work on. She had often felt like pinching Bob for being so stolid. July was no better. In fact, he and Bob were cut from the same mold, a strong but unimaginative mold. When she came down from washing her face, she heard talk from the back and stopped dead on the stairs, for there was no doubt who was talking. The chord of memory that had been weakly struck by the sight of the horseman resounded through her suddenly like an organ note. No sound in the world could have made her happier, for she heard the voice of Augustus McCrae, a voice like no other. He sounded exactly as he always had. Hearing his voice so unexpectedly after 16 years caused her eyes to fill. The sound took the years away. She stood on the stairs in momentary agitation, uncertain for a second as to when it was or where she was. So much did it remind her of other times when Augustus would show up unexpectedly, and she, in her little room over the store, would hear him talking to her parents. Only now he was talking to her girls. Clara regretted not changing blouses. Gus had always appreciated her appearance. She walked on down the stairs and looked out the kitchen window. Sure enough, Gus was standing there in front of his horse, talking to Betsy and Sally. Woodrow Call sat beside him, still mounted, and beside Call, on a bay horse, was a young blonde woman wearing men's clothes. A good-looking boy on a brown mare was the last of the group. Clara noted that Gus had already charmed the girls. July Johnson would be lucky to get another bowl of soup out of them as long as Gus was around. She stood at the window a minute studying him. To her, he seemed not much older. His hair had already turned white when he was young. He had always made her feel keen, Gus. His appetite for talk matched hers. She stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway, a smile on her lips. Just seeing him made her feel keen. She was in the shadows, and he had not seen her. Then she took a step or two, and Augustus looked around. Their eyes met, and he smiled. "Well, pretty as ever," he said. To the huge astonishment of her girls, Clara walked straight off the porch and into the stranger's arms. She had a look in her eyes that they had never seen, and she raised her face to the stranger and kissed him right on the mouth, an action so startling and so unexpected that both girls remembered the moment for the rest of their lives. Newt was so surprised that he scarcely knew where to look. When Clara kissed him, Lorena looked down, nothing but despair in her heart. There the woman was. Gus loved her, and she herself was lost. She should have stayed in the tent and not come to see it, yet she had wanted to come. Now that she had, she would have given anything to be somewhere else. But of course it was too late. When she looked up again, she saw that Clara had stepped back a bit and was looking at Gus, her face shining with happiness. She had thin arms and large hands, Lorena noticed. 2 men were walking up from the lots, having seen the crowd. "Well, introduce your friends, Gus," Clara said. She had a hand on his arm, and walked with him over to the horses. "Oh, you know Woodrow," Augustus said. "How do you do?" Call said, feeling at a loss. "This is Miss Lorena Wood," Augustus said, reaching up to help her dismount. "She's come a far piece with us, all the way from Lonesome Dove, in fact. And this young gentleman is Newt." "Newt who?" Clara asked. "Newt Dobbs," Augustus said after a pause. "Hello, Miss Wood," Clara said. To Lorena's surprise, she seemed quite friendly, far more so than most women were to her. "I don't know whether to envy you or pity you, Miss Wood," Clara said. "Riding all that way with Mr. McCrae, I mean. I know he's entertaining, but that much entertainment could break a person for life." Then Clara laughed, a happy laugh. She was amused that Augustus had seen fit to arrive with a woman. that she had stunned her girls by kissing him, and that Woodrow Call, a man she had always disliked and considered scarcely more interesting than a stump, had been able to think of nothing better to say to her after 16 years than, "How do you do?" It added up to a lively time in her book, and she felt she had been in Nebraska long enough to deserve a little liveliness. She saw that the young woman was very frightened of her. She had dismounted, but kept her eyes cast down. July and Cholo walked up just at that time, July with a look of surprise on his face. "Why, Sheriff Johnson," Augustus said. "I guess, as they say, it's a small world." "Just to you, Gus. You've met everybody in it now, I'm sure," Clara said. She glanced at July, who so far hadn't spoken. He was watching her, and it struck her that it might be because she was still holding Gus's arm. It made Clara want to laugh again. In minutes, the arrival of Gus McCrae had mixed up everyone, just as it usually had in the past. It had always been a peculiarity of her friendship with Augustus. Nobody had ever been able to figure out whether she was in love with him or not. Her parents had puzzled over the question for years. It had replaced Bible arguments as their staple of conversation. Even when she had accepted Bob, Gus's presence in her life confused most people, for she had soon demonstrated that she had no intention of giving him up just because she was planning to marry. The situation had been made the more amusing by the fact that Bob himself worshipped Gus, and would probably have thought it odd that she had chosen him over Gus, if he had been sharp enough to figure out that she could have had Gus if she'd wanted him. It had been one-sided adoration, though, for Gus considered Bob one of the dullest men alive, and often said so. "Why are you marrying that dullard?" he asked her often. "He suits me," she said. "Two racehorses like us would never get along. I'd want to be in the lead, and so would you." "I never thought you'd marry a man with nothing to say," he said. "Talk ain't everything," she said. Words she had often remembered with rue during years when Bob scarcely seemed to utter 2 words a month. Now Gus was back, and had instantly captured her girls, that was clear. Betsy and Sally were fascinated, if embarrassed, that this white-haired man had ridden up and kissed their mother. "Where's Robert?" Augustus asked, to be polite. "Upstairs, sick," Clara said. "A horse kicked him in the head. It's a bad wound." For a second, remembering the silent man upstairs, she thought how unfair life was. Bob was slipping away, and yet that knowledge couldn't quell her happiness at the sight of Gus and his friends. It was a lovely summer day, too, a fine day for a social occasion. "You girls go catch 3 pullets," she said. "I imagine Miss Wood is tired of eating beefsteak. It's such a fair day we might want a picnic a little later." "Oh, Ma, let's do," Sally said. She loved picnics. Clara would have liked a few words with Augustus alone, but that would have to wait until things settled down a little, she saw. Miss Wood mostly kept her eyes down and said nothing, but when she raised them it was always to look at Gus. Clara took them into the kitchen and left them a moment, for she heard the baby. "Now, you see, all your worrying was for nothing," Augustus whispered to Lorena. "She's got a young child." Lorena held her peace. The woman seemed kind. She had even offered her a bath, but she still felt frightened. What she wanted was to be on the trail again with Gus. Her mind kept looking ahead to when the visit would be over and she would have Gus alone again. Then she would feel less frightened. Clara soon came down, a baby in her arms. "It's July's son," she said, handing the baby to Gus as if it were a package. "Well, what do I want with it?" Augustus asked. He had seldom held a baby in his arms and was somewhat discommoded. "Just hold him or give him to Miss Wood," Clara said. "I can't hold him and cook, too." Call, July, and Cholo had walked off to the lots, for Call wanted to buy a few horses, and anyway didn't care to sit in a kitchen and try to make conversation. It amused Lorena that Gus had got stuck with the baby. Somehow it made things more relaxed that the woman would just hand him to Gus that way. She stopped feeling quite so nervous, and she watched the baby chew on his fat little fist. "If this is Sheriff Johnson's child, whereabouts is his wife?" Augustus asked. "Dead," Clara said. "She stopped here with 2 buffalo hunters, had the child, and left. July showed up 2 weeks later, half dead from worry." "So you adopted them both?" Augustus said. "He was always one to grab." "Listen to him," Clara said. "Hasn't seen me in 16 years, and he feels free to criticize." "It's mainly Martin that I wanted," she continued. "As life goes on, I got less and less use for grown men." Lorena smiled in spite of herself. There was something amusing about the sassy way Clara talked. It was no wonder Gus admired her, for he liked to talk a lot himself. "Let me hold him," she said, reaching for the baby. Augustus was glad to hand the baby over. He had been watching Clara and didn't enjoy having to divert his attention to a wiggly baby. It was the same old Clara, so far as spirit went, though her body had changed. She was fuller in the bosom, thinner in the face. The real change was in her hands. As a girl, she had had delicate hands, with long fingers and tiny wrists. Now it was her hands that drew his eyes. The work she had done had swollen and strengthened them. They seemed as large at the joints as a man's. She was peeling potatoes with them and handled a knife as deftly as a trapper. Her hands were no longer as beautiful, but they were arresting. The hands of a formidable woman, perhaps too formidable. Though he had only glanced at her hands, Clara picked up the glance, displaying her old habit of being able to read his mind. "That's right, Gus," she said. "I've coarsened a little, but this country will take your bloom." "It didn't take your bloom," he said, wanting her to know how glad he was that she was in so many ways her old self, the self he remembered with such pleasure. Clara smiled and paused a minute to tickle the baby. She smiled, too, at Newt, who blushed, not used to ladies' smiles. The girls kept looking at him. "You'll have to pardon us, Miss Wood," she said. "Gus and I were old sweethearts. It's a miracle both of us are still alive, considering the lives we've led. We've got to make up for a lot of lost time, if you'll excuse us." Lorena found she didn't mind, not nearly so much as she had thought she would, even a few minutes earlier. It was pleasant to sit in the kitchen and hold the baby. Even hearing Clara josh with Gus was pleasant. "So what happened to Mr. Johnson's wife once she left?" Augustus asked. "She was looking for an old boyfriend," Clara said. "He was a killer who got hung while she was recovering from having the baby. July went and saw her, but she wouldn't have anything to do with him. She and one of the buffalo hunters traveled on, and the Sioux killed her. You watch closer, they'll get you, too," she added. "I guess no Indian would dare bother you," Augustus said. "They know they wouldn't stand a chance." "We kept some of them alive the last few winters, once the buffalo were gone," Clara said. "Bob gives them old horses. Horse meat's better than nothing." She put a little milk in the baby's bottle and showed Lorena how to feed him. The baby stared up solemnly at Lorena as he drank. "He's taken with you, Miss Wood," Clara said. "He's never seen a blonde, I guess." The baby took a sneezing fit, and Lorena was afraid she had done something wrong, but Clara merely laughed at her anxiety, and the child soon settled down. A little later, while Clara was frying the chicken, Call came up from the lots. He wanted to buy some horses and had found some to his liking, but neither Cholo nor July would make the deal. They had shown him the horses readily enough, but informed him that Clara made all the deals. It seemed irregular to him, 2 grown men right there, and yet he was forced to do business with a woman. "I was told you're the horse trader," he said. "Yes," Clara said, "I'm the horse trader. You girls finish this chicken, and I'll see what Captain Call has picked out." She looked again at the boy, who had blushed when she smiled at him. He was saying something to Sally and didn't notice her look. To her eye, he was the spitting image of Captain Call, built the same way and with the same movements. "So why is your name Dobbs?" she wondered. On their way to the lots, Call tried to think of something to say, but he was at a loss. "You have a pretty ranch," he said finally. "I hope we do as well in Montana." "I just hope you get there alive," Clara said. "You ought to settle around here and wait 5 years. I imagine Montana will be safer by then. It ain't safe now." "We're set on being the first there," Call said. "It can't be no rougher than Texas used to be." Clara set such a stiff price for her horses that Call was tempted to balk. He felt sure he would have done better with her husband if he had been up and about. There was something uncompromising in Clara's look when she named the prices. It was as if she dared him to bargain. He had bargained over many a horse in his day, but never with a woman. He felt shy. Worse, he felt she didn't like him, though so far as he could remember he had never given her any reason to take offense. He studied the situation in silence for several minutes, so long that Clara grew impatient. Newt had followed them, thinking the captain might need him to help with the horses if he bought some. He could see that the captain was mighty put out with the woman. It surprised him that she didn't seem to care. When the captain was put out with the men, they cared, but the woman just stood there, her brown hair blowing, not caring in the least, and not giving an inch. It was shocking. He had never expected to see anyone stand up to the captain, except maybe Mr. Gus. "I'm neglecting my guests," Clara said. "There's no telling when I'll get to see Gus McCrae again. You take all the time you want to think it over." Newt was even more shocked. The captain didn't say a word. It was almost as if the woman had issued him an order. The woman turned, and as she did, she looked at Newt. Before he could drop his eyes, she had caught him looking at her in turn. He felt greatly embarrassed, but to his surprise, Clara smiled again, a friendly smile that vanished when she turned back to the captain. "Well, it's a stiff price, but they're good horses," Call said, wondering how the men could bring themselves to work for such a testy woman. Then he remembered that the younger man had been the sheriff chasing Jake. "You come from Arkansas, don't you?" he asked. "Fort Smith," July said. "We hung your man for you," Call said. "He fell in with a bad bunch. We caught them up in Kansas." For a second, July didn't remember what he was talking about. It seemed a life ago that he had left Fort Smith in pursuit of Jake Spoon. He had long since ceased to give the man any thought. The news that he was dead did not affect him. "I doubt I would have caught him myself," July said. "I had horse trouble up around Dodge." When Clara got back to the house, she was in high color. The way Call had stood there silently, not even asking a question or making an offer, just waiting for her to come down on the price, struck her as arrogant. The more she thought about it, the less hospitable she felt toward the man. "I can't say that I'm fond of your partner," she said to Augustus. He had talked the girls out of some chicken gizzards and was eating them off a plate. "He ain't skilled with the ladies," Augustus said, amused that she was angry. As long as she wasn't angry at him, it just made her the better looking. "Ma, shall we take buttermilk?" Betsy asked. She and Sally had changed dresses without their mother's permission, and were so excited by the prospect of a picnic that they could hardly keep still. "Yes, today we feast," Clara said. "I asked Cholo to hitch the little wagon. One of you go change that baby. He's rather fragrant." "I'll help," Lorena said. It surprised Augustus, but she went off upstairs with the girls. Clara stood listening as their footsteps went up the stairs. Then she turned her deep gray eyes on Augustus. "She's hardly older than my daughters," Clara said. "Don't you be scolding me," he said. "It ain't my fault you went off and got married." "If I'd married you, you would have left me for somebody younger and stupider long before now, I imagine," Clara said. To his surprise, she came over and stood near him for a moment, putting one of her large, strong hands on his shoulder. "I like your girl," she said. "What I don't like is that you spent all these years with Woodrow Call. I detest that man, and it rankles that he got so much of you, and I got so little. I think I had the better claim." Augustus was taken aback. The anger in her was in her eyes again, this time directed at him. "Where have you been for the last 15 years?" she asked. "Lonesome Dove, mostly," he said. "I wrote you 3 letters." "I got them," she said. "And what did you accomplish in all that time?" "Drank a lot of whiskey," Augustus said. Clara nodded and went back to packing the picnic basket. "If that was all you accomplished, you could have done it in Ogallala and been a friend to me," she said. "I lost 3 boys, Gus. I needed a friend." "You ought to wrote me that then," he said. "I didn't know." Clara's mouth tightened. "I hope I meet a man sometime in my life who can figure such things out," she said. "I wrote you, but I tore up the letters. I figured if you didn't come of your own accord, you wouldn't be no good to me anyway." "Well, you was married," he said, not knowing why he bothered to argue. "I was never so married but what I could have managed a friend," she said. "I want you to look at Bob before you go. The poor man's laid up there for 2 months, wasting away." The anger had died out of her eyes. She came and sat down in a chair, looking at him in the intent way she had, as if reading in his face the events of the 15 years he had spent away from her. "Where'd you get Miss Wood?" she asked. "She's been in Lonesome Dove a while," he said. "Doing what?" "Doing what she could, but don't you hold it against her," he said. Clara looked at him coolly. "I don't judge women that harsh," she said. "I might have done the same under some circumstances." "I doubt it," he said. "Yes, but you don't know as much about women as you like to think you do," Clara said. "You're overrated in that regard." "By God, you're sassy," Augustus said. Clara just smiled, her old, beguiling smile. "I'm honest," she said. "To most men, that's sassy." "Well, it might interest you to know that Laurie started this trip with your old friend Jake Spoon," Augustus said. "He was his usual careless self and let her get kidnapped by a real rough man." "Oh, so you rescued her," Clara said. "No wonder she worships you." "What happened to Jake?" "He met a bad end," Augustus said. "We hung him. He was with a gang of murderers." Clara didn't flinch at the news. She heard the girls coming back down the stairs. Lorena was carrying the baby. Clara stood up so Lorena could sit. The baby's eyes followed her. "Betsy, go find July and the men and ask them if they want to wash up before we go," she said. "I doubt you can get Woodrow Call to go to your picnic," Augustus said. "He'll be wanting to get back to work." But Call went. He had come back to the house, still trying to think of a way to talk Clara down on the horses, only to find the girls loading a small wagon, Lorena holding a baby, and Gus carrying a crock of buttermilk. "Could you drive for us, Captain?" Clara asked, handing him the reins to the little mule team before he could answer. With such a crowd there watching, he couldn't muster a protest, and he drove the little wagon 3 miles west on the Platte to a place where there were a few small cottonwoods. "It ain't as nice as our place on the Guadalupe, Gus, but it's the best we can do," Clara said. "Oh, your orchard, you mean," Augustus said. Clara looked puzzled for a moment. She had forgotten that that was what they called the picnic spot on the Guadalupe. The day remained fair, and the picnic was a great success for everyone except Captain Call and July Johnson, both of whom felt awkward and merely waited for it to be over. The girls tried to get July to wade in the Platte, but he resisted solemnly. Newt waded, and then Lorena, rolling up her pants, and Lorena and Betsy walked far downstream, out of sight of the party. The baby dozed in the shade while Clara and Augustus bantered. The 16-year gap in their communications proved no hindrance at all. Then Augustus rolled up his pants and waded with the girls, while Clara and Lorena watched. All the food was consumed, Call drinking about half the buttermilk himself. He had always loved buttermilk and had not had any for a long time. "You don't plan on returning to Arkansas, Mr. Johnson?" he asked. "I don't know that I will," July said. In fact, he had given no thought to his future at all. Augustus ate most of the fried chicken and marveled at how comfortable Lorena seemed to be. She liked the girls, and seeing her with them reminded him that she was not much more than a girl herself, despite her experiences. He knew that she had been advanced too quickly into life, though perhaps not so far to yet enjoy a bit of girlhood. When it came time to go back to the ranch, he helped Laurie into the wagon with the girls, and he and Clara walked behind. Newt, who had enjoyed the picnic mightily, fell into conversation with Sally and rode beside the wagon. Lorena didn't seem concerned. She and Betsy had taken to one another at once and were chatting happily. "You should leave that girl here," Clara said, startling Augustus. He had been thinking the same thing. "I doubt she'd stay," he said. "If you stay out of it, she might," Clara said. "I'll ask her. You have no business taking a girl like that into Montana. She might not survive." "In some ways she ain't so young," he said. "I like her," Clara said, ignoring him. I expect you'll marry her, and I'll have to watch you have 5 or 6 babies in your old age. I guess I'd be annoyed, but I could live with it. Don't take her up to Montana. She'll either die or get killed, or else she'll age before her time like I have." "I can't tell that you've aged much," Augustus said. "You've just been around me one day," Clara said. "There's certain things I can still do and certain things I'm finished with." "What things are you finished with?" he asked. "You'd find out if you stayed around me much," Clara said. "I notice you've taken a fancy to young Mr. Johnson," Augustus said. "I expect if I did stay around, he'd beat me out." "He's nearly as dull as Woodrow Call, but he's nicer," Clara said. "He'll do what he's told, mostly, and I've come to appreciate that quality in a man. I could never count on you to do what you're told." "So you do aim to marry him?" "No, that's one of the things I'm through with," Clara said. "Of course I ain't quite. Poor Bob ain't dead. But if he passes away, I'm through with it." Clara smiled. Augustus chuckled. "I hope you ain't contemplating an irregular situation," he said. Clara smiled. "What's irregular about having a boarder?" she asked. "Lots of widows take boarders. Anyway, he likes my girls better than he likes me. He might be ready to marry again by the time Sally's of age." At that moment, Sally was chattering away to young Newt, who was getting his first taste of conversation with a sprightly young lady. "Who's his mother?" Clara asked. She liked the boy's looks and also his manners. "I never knew Call was prone to ladies," she added. "Oh, Woodrow ain't," Augustus said. "He can barely stand to be within 50 yards of you." "I know that," Clara said. "He's been stiff all day because I won't bargain away my horses. My price is my price. But that boy's his, and don't you tell me he ain't. They walk alike, they stand alike, and they look alike." "I expect you're right," Augustus said. "Yes, I'm right," Clara said. "You ain't answered my question." "His mother was a woman named Maggie," he said. "She was a whore. She died when Newt was 6. "I like that boy," Clara said. "I'd keep him, too, if I got the chance. He's about the age my Jimmy would be if Jimmy had lived." "Newt's a fine boy," Augustus said. "It's a miracle, ain't it, when one grows up nice?" Clara said. "He's got a quiet way, that boy. I like that. It's surprising to find gentle behavior when his father is Captain Call." "Oh, Newt don't know Call's his father," Augustus said. "I expect he's heard hints, but he don't know it." "And Call don't claim him when anybody can see it?" Clara said, shocked. "I never had much opinion of Call, and now I have less." "Call don't like to admit mistakes," Augustus said. "It's his way." "What mistake?" Clara said. "I wouldn't call it a mistake if I raised a boy that nice. My Jimmy had wildness in him. I couldn't handle him, though he died when he was 8. I expect he'd have ended up like Jake. Now, where'd it come from? I ain't wild, and Bob ain't wild." "I don't know," Augustus said. "Well, I had 2 sweet ones, though," Clara said. "My last one, Johnny, was the sweetest. I ain't been the same since that child died. It's a wonder the girls aren't worse behaved than they are. I don't consider that I've ever had the proper feeling for them. It went out of me that winter I lost Jeff and Johnny." They walked in silence for a while. "Why don't you tell that boy who his pa is?" Clara said. "I'd do it if he was around here long. He should know who his pa is. He's got to wonder." "I always thought Call would work up to it eventually," Augustus said. "I still think so." "I don't," Clara said. A big gray wolf loped up out of the riverbed, looked at them for a moment, and loped on. Ahead, the baby was fretting, and the girls and Lorena were trying to shush it. When they got back to the ranch, Call gave in and told Clara he'd pay her price for the horses. He didn't like it, but he couldn't stay around there forever, and her horses were in far better condition than the nags he had looked at in Ogallala. "Fine. Go help him, boys," Clara said. Cholo and July went off to help. Newt was helping the girls carry the remains of the picnic in. He was sorry they were leaving. Sally had been telling him all she planned to do when she grew up. She was going east to school, and then planned to play the piano professionally, she said. That seemed unusual to Newt. The only musician he knew was Lippy, and he couldn't imagine Sally doing what Lippy did, but he enjoyed listening to her talk about her future life. As he was coming down the steps, Clara stopped him. She put an arm across his shoulder and walked him to his horse. No woman had ever done such a thing with him. "Newt, we've enjoyed having you," Clara said. "I want you to know that if Montana don't suit you, you can just head back here. I'll give you all the work you can stand." "I'd like to," Newt said. He meant it. Since meeting the girls and seeing the ranch, he had begun to wonder why they were taking the herd so far. It seemed to him Nebraska had plenty of room. For most of the trip, Newt had supposed that nothing could be better than being allowed to be a cowboy. But now that they had got to Nebraska, his thinking was changing. Between the buffalo heifer and the other whores in Ogallala, and Clara's spirited daughters, he had begun to see that a world with women in it could be even more interesting. The taste he had of that world seemed all too brief. Though he had been more or less scared of Clara all day, and was still a little scared of her, there was something powerfully appealing about her, too. "Thank you for the picnic," he said. "I never went on one before." Something in the boy touched Clara. Boys had always touched her, far more than girls. This one had a lonely look in his eye, although he also had a quick smile. "Come back when you can. We'll go on many more," she said. "I believe Sally's taken a fancy to you." Newt didn't know what to say to that. He got on his horse. "I expect I'd better go help, ma'am," he said. "If you get to choose one of my horses, choose that little sorrel with the star on his forehead," Clara said. "He's the best of that bunch." "Oh, I imagine Dish will get the first pick," Newt said. "Dish is our top hand." "Well, I don't want Dish to have him," Clara said. "I want you to have him. Come on." She started for the lots and made straight for Call. "Captain," she said, "there's a 3-year-old sorrel gelding with a white star on his forehead in this lot you bought. I want to give that horse to Newt, so don't let anyone have him. You can deduct him from the price." "Give it to him?" Call asked, surprised. Newt, who overheard, was surprised, too. The woman who drove such a hard bargain wanted to give him a horse. "Yes, I'm making him a gift," Clara said. "I'd feel better knowing Newt was well mounted, if you're really going to take him to Montana." With that, she went back to the house. Call looked at the boy. "Why'd she do that?" he asked. Of course, it was fine for the boy to have the horse. It saved $50. "I don't know," Newt said. "That's the whole trouble with women," Call said, as if to himself. "They do things that don't make sense. She wouldn't give a nickel on the rest of them horses. Most horse traders would have taken off $1 just to help the deal." Chapter 88. After Call and Newt left with the horses, Clara lit a lantern and took Augustus up to the room where her husband lay. Lorena sat at the kitchen table with the girls, playing drafts. July watched, but could not be persuaded to take part in the game. Even Betsy, his favorite, couldn't persuade him, and Betsy could usually get July to do anything she wanted him to do. Lorena's presence made him shy. He enjoyed sitting and looking at her in the lamplight, though. It seemed to him he had never seen anyone so beautiful. He had only seen her before on that dreadful morning on the plains, when he had had to bury Roscoe, Joe, and Janey, and had been too stricken to notice her. Then she had been bruised and thin from her treatment by Blue Duck and the Kiowas. Now she was neither bruised nor thin. Clara and Augustus sat for an hour in the room where Bob lay. Augustus found it difficult to get used to the fact that the man's eyes were open. Clara had ceased to care or even notice. "He's been that way 2 months, she said. "I guess he sees some, but I don't think he hears." "It reminds me of old Tom Mustard," Augustus said. "He rangered with us when we started the troop. His horse went over a cut bank on the Salt Fork of the Brazos one night and fell on him. Broke his back. Tom never moved a muscle after that, but his eyes were open when we found him. We started back to Austin with Tom on a travois, but he died a week later. He never closed his eyes in all that time that I know of." "I wish Bob would go," Clara said. He's no use to himself like this. All Bob liked to do was work, and now he can't." They walked out on the little upper porch, where it was cooler. "Why'd you come up here, Gus?" she asked. "You ain't a cowboy." "The truth is, I was hoping to find you a widow," he said. "I didn't miss by much, either." Clara was amused that her old beau would be so blunt. "You missed by years," she said. "I'm a bony old woman now, and you're a deceiving man anyway. You always were a deceiving man. I think the best thing would be for you to leave me your bride-to-be, and I'll see if I can give her some polish." "I never meant to get in the position I'm in, to be truthful," Augustus said. "No, but you like it now that you're in it," Clara said, taking his hand. "She's got nearly as high an opinion of you as you have of yourself, Gus. I could never match it. I know your character too well. She's younger and prettier, which is always a consideration with you men." Augustus had forgotten how fond she was of goading him. Even with a dying husband in the next room, she was capable of it. The only chance with Clara was to be as bold as she was. He looked at her and was thinking of kissing her. Clara saw the look and was startled by it. Although she kissed her girls every day and lavished kisses on the baby, it had been years since she had been kissed by a man. Bob would occasionally kiss her cheek if he had returned from a trip. Otherwise, kissing played no part in his view of married love. Looking off the porch, with Augustus standing near her, Clara felt sad. She mainly had snatched kisses from her courtship with Gus or Jake 20 years before to remember. She looked at Gus again, wondering if he would really be so bold or so foolish. He didn't move to kiss her, but he still stood close and looked into her face. "The older the violin, the sweeter the music," he said with a smile. "That proves you're a deceiving man if you think that," she said. "You've had a long ride for nothing, I guess." "Why, no," he said. "It's happiness to see you." Clara felt a sudden irritation. "Do you think you can have us both?" she said. "My husband isn't dead. I haven't seen you in 16 years. I've mostly raised children and horses during those years. 3 of the children died, and plenty of the horses. It took all the romance out of me, if romance is what you were hoping for. I read about it in my magazines, but I left it behind for myself when I left Austin." "Don't you regret it?" Augustus asked. "Oh, well," Clara said, "yes and no. I'm too strong for the normal man, and too jealous once my feelings get started. I'm surprised you dare bring another woman into my house." "I thought you liked her," he said. "I do like her," Clara said. "I mind you doing it, though. Don't you understand the facts of nature yet? She's younger and prettier." "It happened accidentally, like I mentioned," Augustus said. "I never noticed you having such accidents with ugly girls," Clara said. "I don't care how it happened. You've been my dream, Gus. I used to think about you 2 or 3 hours a day." "I wish you'd wrote then," he said. "I didn't want you here," she said. "I needed the dreams. I knew you for a rake and a rambler, but it was sweet to pretend you only loved me." "I do only love you, Clara," he said. "I've grown right fond of Laurie, but it ain't like this feeling I have for you." "Well, she loves you," Clara said. "It would destroy her if I was to have you. Don't you know that?" "Yes, I know that," Augustus said, thinking there would never again be such a woman as the one who looked at him with anger in her face. "Would you destroy her, then, if I said stay?" Clara asked. "I expect so," Augustus said. "That ain't an answer." "Yes, you know I would," he said. "I'd smother Bob for you and send Laurie to perdition." Clara sighed, and her anger wore out with the sigh. "Such talk," she said. "Bob'll die when he can manage it, and I'll see what I can do for your bride. It's just her beauty that set me off. I was always the youngest and prettiest, and now I'm not." "You're mighty pretty. And anyway, pretty ain't everything," he said. "Where men like you are concerned, it's 99%, she said. "You ain't had time to look at me close. I ain't the prettiest anymore. The prettiest is downstairs." "I'd still like a kiss," he said. A tickle of amusement took her. He saw her smile and took it for encouragement. When he bent forward, the result was so bland that after a moment Clara drew back her head and laughed. "You've ridden a long way for some pretty weak courtin'," she said, but she felt better. Gus looked rather hangdog at his failure, one of the few times she had ever seen him look that way. "You beat any woman I ever saw for taking the starch out of a man," he said, a little perplexed. Despite all the complications, he felt his old love for her returning with its old power. So much feeling flooded him, just looking at her, that he felt shaky. It was a puzzle to him that such a thing could happen, for it was true she had become rather bony, and her face had thinned too much, and certainly she was as taxing as a woman could be. And yet the feeling made him shaky. "Think I'm rough, Gus?" she asked with a smile. "I ain't been scorched by lightning, but I doubt it could be hotter than being scorched by you," he said. "Still think you'd have been up to being married to me?" "I don't know," he said truthfully. Clara laughed and took his arm to lead him downstairs. "What about the young sheriff?" he asked, stopping her. He was unwilling to end their privacy so soon. "What sheriff?" "Why, July Johnson," he said. "It seems you've adopted him." "I mainly wanted the baby. But I guess it's only fair to keep the father, too," she said. "Keep him and do what with him?" "What do you care?" Clara said. "You're engaged. You can ride all over the country with a pretty girl. I guess I can be allowed a man. I'd forgotten how jealous you were. You were jealous of Jake, and I did little more than flirt with Jake." "To hear him talk, you did," Augustus said. "Neither of us will hear him talk again," Clara said, "and I won't marry again." "What makes you so sure?" "I don't have enough respect for men," she said. "I found very few who are honest, and you ain't one of the few." "I'm about half honest," Augustus said. "That's right," she said, and led him on downstairs. To his surprise, Clara simply walked into the kitchen and invited Lorena to stay with them while the herd went on to Montana. "We could use your help, and you'd be more than welcome," she said. "Montana's no place for a lady." Lorena blushed when she said it. No one had ever applied the word lady to her before. She knew she didn't deserve it. She wasn't a lady like Clara. She had never even met a lady like Clara, and in the space of a day had come to admire her more than she had ever admired anyone excepting Gus. Clara had shown her nothing but courtesy, and had made her welcome in her house, whereas other respectable women had always shunned her because of the way she lived. Sitting in the kitchen with the girls and the baby, Lorena felt happy in a way that was new to her. It stirred in her distant memories of the days she had spent in her grandmother's house in Mobile when she was 4. Her grandmother's house had been like Clara's. She had gone there only once that she could remember. Her grandmother had put her in a soft bed, the softest she had ever slept in, and sung songs to her while she went to sleep. It was her happiest memory, one she treasured so that in her years of traveling she grew almost afraid to remember it. Someday she might try to remember it and find it gone. She was very afraid of losing her one good, warm memory. If she lost that, she felt she might be too sad to go on. But in Clara's house, she wasn't afraid to remember her grandmother and the softness of the bed. Clara's house was the kind of house she thought she might live in someday. At least she had hoped to when she was little. But when her parents sickened and died, she lost hope of living in such a house. Mosby's home had been nothing like it, and then she had started living in hotels or little rooms. She slowly stopped thinking of nice houses and the things that went with them, such as little girls and babies. So when Clara came downstairs and asked her to stay, it felt like being given back something that had been lost so long that she had ceased to think about it. Just before Clara and Gus came in, the girls had been nagging her to teach them how to sew. Lorena could sew fairly well. The girls complained that their mother never took the time to teach them. Their mother, about whom they were full of gripes, was more interested in horses than in sewing. The girls were not at all surprised when Clara asked Lorena to stay. "Oh, do," Sally said. "We could learn to sew if you would." "We could sew new dresses. We never get any," Betsy said. Lorena looked at Gus. He seemed flustered, and he seldom was flustered. She thought he might be bothered by the thought of her staying. "Would you come back, Gus?" she asked. It seemed all right to ask him in front of Clara and the girls. Clara, after issuing the invitation, had started making coffee. Augustus saw that she wanted to stay. If asked that morning if such a thing could occur, he would have said it was impossible. Lorena had clung to him since the rescue, but being at Clara's, even for so short a space, had changed her. She had refused to go to Ogallala, and was frightened of the thought of going into a store, but she wasn't frightened of Clara. "I sure will come back," he said, smiling. "A ladies' man like me could hardly be expected to resist such a passel of ladies." "Good. That's settled. But I'll warn you, Laurie, these girls will wear you down," Clara said. "You may wish you were back in a cow camp before it's all over." "I'm going to turn them over to you, you know. All they want to do is quarrel with me, and I'm tired of it. You can argue with them, and I'll break horses." After the coffee, Clara made the girls go to bed, and tactfully went up herself so that Augustus and Lorena could have a moment alone. She saw that Augustus was a little shocked that she had so easily persuaded the girl away from his side. Lorena felt embarrassed. She had not expected to be asked to stay or to want to, yet both things had happened. She was afraid at first that Gus might have his feelings hurt. She looked at him a little fearfully, hard put to explain the strange desire she had to stay at Clara's. Only that morning she had been resolved to stay with Gus at all costs. "I'll go if you want, Gus," she said. "But it's so nice here, and they're friendly." "I'm happy for you to stay," Augustus said. "You'll be a help to Clara, and you'll enjoy those girls. You've spent time enough in that dirty tent of Will Barger's. Winter's said to be hard in Montana, too." "I didn't think I'd want to stay," Lorena admitted. "I never thought about it till she asked. Don't you still want to marry her, Gus?" "No," Augustus lied. "I don't see why you wouldn't," she said. Now that she knew Clara a little, it seemed perfectly natural that Gus would want to marry her. "Well, time's changed us," he said, feeling very uneasy in the conversation. Lorena was looking at him solemnly. He had had women look at him solemnly before, and it always made him uncomfortable. It meant they were primed to detect any lies. "I don't think nobody could change you, Gus," she said. "Maybe you'll want to marry her when you come back." "Why, I'll be coming back to you, Laurie," Augustus said. "Of course, by then you might change, too. You might not want me." "Why wouldn't I?" "Because you'll have discovered there's more to the world than me," he said. "You'll find that there are others that treat you decent." What he said caused Lorena to feel confused. Since the rescue, life had been simple. It had been just Gus. With him gone, it might change, and when he came back, it might have changed so much that it would never be simple again. Yet when it had been simple, she had always worried that Gus didn't want it. Maybe he was just being kind. She didn't know what things meant or didn't mean. She had never expected to find in the whole world a place where someone would ask her to stay. Even in her dreams of San Francisco, no one had ever asked her to stay. She had seldom even spoken to a woman in her years in Lonesome Dove, and had no expectation that one would speak to her. The fact that Clara had volunteered made everything seem different. "Can't you wait till morning to leave?" she asked. "No, I'm going as soon as I can saddle up," Augustus said. "It takes willpower to leave a house full of ladies just to ride along with some scraggly cowhands. I better do it now if I'm going to." Clara came downstairs to see him off. She held the baby, who was colicky and wakeful. They went outside with Augustus, Lorena feeling trembly, not sure of what she was doing. Cholo was going with him to Ogallala to bring back all the clothes he had bought her. Clara devoted 5 minutes to trying to persuade him to settle somewhere on the Platte. "There's cheap land not 3 days' ride from here," she pointed out. "You could have the whole north part of this state if you wanted it. Why go to Montana?" "Well, that's where we started for," he said. "Me and Col have always liked to get where we started for, even if it don't make a damn bit of sense." "It don't, and I wish I knew of some way to divorce you from that man," Clara said. He ain't worth it, Gus. Besides, the Montana Indians can outfight you. You bought these here Indians off with horses, he said. Maybe we can buy those in Montana off with beef. It bothers me, Clara said. You ain't a cattleman. Why do you want to be so stubborn? You've come far enough. You could settle around here and be some use to me and Laurie. It amused Augustus that his Laurie had been adopted as an ally by his old love. The old love and the new stood by his horse's head, neither of them looking quite calm. Clara, in fact, was getting angry. Lorena looked sad. He hugged them both and gave them each a kiss. "We've heard Montana's the last place that ain't settled," Augustus said. "I'd like to see one more place that ain't settled before I get decrepit and have to take up the rocking chair." "You call Nebraska settled?" Clara asked. "Well, you're here," he said. "It won't last long. Pretty soon it'll be nothing but schoolhouses." With that he mounted, tipped his hat to them, and turned toward the Platte. The two women stood where they were until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Lorena felt wrong. Part of her felt she should have gone with him to look after him, but she knew that was foolish. Gus, if anyone, could look after himself. She was dry-eyed and felt blank, but Clara cried, tears born of vexation, long affection, and regret. "He was always stubborn like that," she said, attempting to control herself. "He left so quick," Lorena said. "Do you think I should have gone? I don't know what's best." "No, I'm glad you stayed," Clara said. "You've had enough rough living. Not that it can't be rough around here, but it won't be as rough as Montana." She put her arm around the girl as they turned toward the house. "Come on in," she said. "I'll show you where to sleep. We've got a nice little room that might suit you." Chapter 89. When Augustus returned without Lorena, Dish Boggett felt deeply unhappy. It shocked him that Gus would leave her. Though he had been constantly jealous while she was traveling with Gus, at least she was there. In the evening he would often see her sitting outside the tent. He dreamed about her often. Once it even dreamed that she was sleeping near him. In the dream she was so beautiful that he ached when he woke up. That Gus had seen fit to leave her on the Platte made him terribly irritable. Newt was happy with his new horse, which he named Candy. It was the first real gift he had ever been given in his life, and he talked to anyone who would listen of the wonderful woman on the Platte who knew how to break horses and conduct picnics, too. His enthusiasm soon caused the other hands to be jealous, for they had accomplished nothing except a drunken Ogallala, and had missed the nice picnic and the girls. Though confident that he had done the right thing in leaving Lorena, Augustus soon found that he missed her more than he had expected to. He missed Clara, too, and for a few days was in a surly mood. He had grown accustomed to sleeping late and sitting outside the tent with Lorena in the mornings. Alone on the long plain, with no cowboys to disturb her, she was a beautiful companion, whereas the cowboys who gathered around Pocampo's cook fire every morning were far from beautiful in his view. It was high summer, the days blazing hot almost until the sun touched the horizon. The cattle were mulish and hard to move, stopping whenever possible to graze or simply to stand. For several days they trailed west along the Platte, but when the river curved south toward Colorado, Call pointed the herd northwest. Pocampo hated to leave the river. The morning they left it, he lingered behind so long with the wagon that the herd was completely out of sight. Lippy, who rode on the wagon, found this fact alarming. After all, they were in Indian country, and there was nothing to keep a few Indians from nipping in and taking their scalps. "What are we waiting on?" Lippy asked. "We're 3 miles behind already." Pocampo stood by the water's edge, looking across the Platte to the south. He was thinking of his dead sons, killed by Blue Duck on the Canadian. He didn't think often of his sons, but when he did, a feeling of sadness filled him, a feeling so heavy that it was an effort for him to move. Thinking of them in their graves in New Mexico made him feel disloyal, made him feel that he should have shot himself and been buried with them. For was it not the duty of a parent to stay with the children? But he had left, first to go south and kill his faithless wife, and now to the north, while Blue Duck, the killer, still rode free on the Llano, unless someone had killed him, which Pocampo doubted. Lippy's fears about Indians did not move him. The sight of flowing water moved him, stirring feelings in him which, though sad, were deep feelings. They made him want to sing his saddest songs. He finally turned and plodded after the herd, Lippy following at a slow walk in the wagon. But Pocampo felt they were wrong to leave the river. He became moody and ceased to have pride in his cooking. And if the cowboys complained, he said nothing. Also, he grew stingy with water, which irritated the cowboys, who came in parched and dusty, dying for a drink. Pocampo would only give them a dipperful each. "You will wish you had this water when you drink your own piss," he said to Jasper one evening. "I ain't planning on drinking my own piss, or anybody else's either," Jasper said. "You have not been very thirsty, then," Po said. "I once drank the urine of a mule. It kept me alive." "Well, it couldn't taste much worse than that Ogallala beer," Needle observed. "My tongue's been peeling ever since we was there." "It ain't what you drink that causes your tongue to peel," Augustus said. "That's the result of who you bedded down with." The remark caused much apprehension among the men, and they were apprehensive anyway, mainly because everyone they met in Ogallala assured them they were dead men if they tried to go to Montana. As they edged into Wyoming, the country grew bleaker. The grass was no longer as luxuriant as it had been in Kansas and Nebraska. To the north were sandy slopes where the grass only grew in tufts. Dietz ranged far ahead during the day looking for water. He always found it, but the streams grew smaller and the water more alkaline. "Near as bad as the Pecos," Augustus said. Call seemed only mildly concerned about the increasing dryness. Indeed, Call was cheerful, easier on the men than was his wont. He seemed relaxed and almost at ease with himself. "Have you cheered up because I left Laurie behind?" Augustus asked as they were riding together one morning. Far to the south they saw a black line of mountains. To the north there was only the dusty plain. "That was your business," Call said. "I didn't tell you to leave her behind, though I'm sure it's the best thing." "I think we ought to have listened to our cook," Augustus said. "It looks droughty to me." "If we can make Powder River, I guess we'll be all right," Call said. "What if Jake lied to us?" Augustus said. "What if Montana ain't the paradise he said it was? We'll have come a hell of a way for nothing." "I want to see it," Call said. "We'll be the first to graze cattle on it. Don't that interest you?" "Not much," Augustus said. "I've watched these goddamn cattle graze all I want to." The next day Dietz came back from his scout looking worried. "Dry as a bone, Captain," he said. "How far did you go?" 20 miles and more," Dietz said. The plain ahead was white with heat. Of course the cattle could make 20 miles, though it would be better to wait a day and drive them at night. "I was told that if we went straight west we'd strike Salt Creek and could follow it to the Powder," Call said. "It can't be too far." "It don't take much to be too far in this heat," Augustus said. "Try going due north," Call said. Dietz changed horses and left. It was well after dark when he reappeared. Call stopped the herd, and the men lounged around the wagon playing cards. While they played, the Texas bull milled through the cows, now and then mounting one. Augustus kept one eye on his cards and one eye on the bull, keeping a loose count of his winnings and of the bull's. "That's 6 he's had since we started playing," he said. "That sucker's got more stamina than me." "More opportunity, too," Alan O'Brien observed. He had adjusted quite well to the cowboy life, but he still could not forget Ireland. When he thought of his little wife, he would break into tears of homesickness, and the songs he sung to the cattle would often remind him of her. When Dietz returned, it was to report that there was no water to the north. "No antelope, Captain," he said. "The plains of western Nebraska had been spotted with them." "I'll have a look in the morning," Call said. "You rest, Dietz." He found he couldn't sleep, and rose at 3 to saddle the hell-bitch. Pocampo was up, stirring the coals of his cook-fire, but Call only took a cup of coffee. "Have you been up here before?" he asked. The old cook's wanderings had been a subject of much speculation among the men. Campo was always letting slip tantalizing bits of information. Once, for example, he had described the great gorge of the Columbia River. Again, he had casually mentioned Jim Bridger. "No," Campo said, "I don't know this country. But I'll tell you this, it is dry. Water your horse before you leave." Call thought the old man rather patronizing. He knew enough to water a horse before setting off into a desert. "Don't wait supper," he said. All day he rode west, and the country around him grew more bleak. Not fit for sheep, Call thought, not hardly fit for lizards. In fact, a small gray lizard was the only life he saw all day. That night he made a dry camp in sandy country where the dirt was light-colored, almost white. He supposed he had come some 60 miles, and could not imagine that the herd would make it that far, although the hell-bitch seemed unaffected. He slept for a few hours and went on, arriving just after sunup on the banks of Salt Creek. It was not running, but there was adequate water in scattered shallow pools. The water was not good, but it was water. The trouble was the herd was nearly 80 miles back, a 4-day drive under normal conditions, and in this case the miles were entirely waterless, which wouldn't make for normal conditions. Call rested the mare and let her have a good roll. Then he started back and rode almost straight through, only stopping once for 2 hours' rest. He arrived in camp at mid-morning to find most of the hands still playing cards. When he unsaddled the mare, one of Augustus's pigs grunted at him. Both of them were lying under the wagon, sharing the shade with Lippy, who was sound asleep. The shote was a large pig now, but travel had kept him thin. Call felt it was slightly absurd having pigs along on a cattle drive, but they had proven good foragers as well as good swimmers. They got across the rivers without any help. Augustus was oiling his rifle. "How far did you ride that horse?" he asked. "To the next water and back," Call said. "Did you ever see a horse like her? She ain't even tired." "How far is it to water?" Augustus asked. "About 80 miles, Call said. What do you think?" "I ain't give it no thought at all so far," Augustus said. "We can't just sit here," Call said. "Oh, we could," Augustus said. "We could have stopped pretty much anywhere along the way. It's only your stubbornness kept us going this long. I guess it'll be interesting to see if it can get us the next 80 miles. Call got a plate and ate a big meal. He expected Campo to say something about their predicament, but the old cook merely dished out the food and said nothing. Dietz was helping P.I. trim one of his horse's feet, a task P.I. had never been good at. "Find the water, Captain?" Dietz asked, smiling. "I found it, about 80 miles away," Call said. "That's far," P.I. said. They had stopped the cattle at the last stream that Dietz had found, and now Call walked down it a way to think things over. He saw a gray wolf. It seemed to him to be the same wolf they had seen in Nebraska after the picnic, but he told himself that was foolish speculation. A gray wolf wouldn't follow a cattle herd. Dietz finished trimming the horse's hooves and wiped the sweat off his face with his shirt sleeve. P.I. stood silently nearby. Though the two of them had soldiered together for most of their lives, they had never really had a conversation. It had seemed unnecessary. They exchanged information, and that was about it. P, indeed, had always been a little doubtful of the propriety of talking to Negroes, although he liked and respected Dietz, and was grateful to him now for trimming the horse's feet. He knew Dietz was a great deal more competent than he was in many areas, tracking, for example. He knew that if it had not been for Dietz's skill in finding water, they might have all starved years before in the campaigns on the Llano. He knew, too, that Dietz had risked his life a number of times to save his, and yet standing there side by side, the only thing he could think of to talk about was the captain's great love for the hell-bitch. "Well, he's mighty fond of that horse," he said, "and she might kill him yet." "She ain't going to kill the captain," Dietz said. He had the sad sense that things were not right. It seemed they were going to go north forever, and he couldn't think why. Life had been orderly and peaceful in Texas. He himself had particularly enjoyed his periodic trips to San Antonio to deposit money. Texas had always been their country, and it was a puzzle to him why they were going to a country that would probably be so wild there wouldn't even be banks to take money to. "We way up here, and it ain't our country," he said, looking at P. That was the heart of it. Best to stay in your own country and not go wandering off where you didn't know the rivers or the water holes. "Now up here, it's going to be cold," he added, as if that were proof enough of the folly of their trip. "Well, I hope we get there before the rivers start icing," P said. "I always worry about that thin ice." With that he turned away, and the lengthy conversation was over. By mid-afternoon, Call came back from his walk and decided they would go ahead. It was go ahead or go back, and he didn't mean to go back. It wasn't rational to think of driving cattle over 80 waterless miles, but he had learned in his years of tracking Indians that things which seemed impossible often weren't. They only became so if one thought about them too much, so that fear took over. The thing to do was go. Some of the cattle might not make it, but then he had never expected to reach Montana with every head. He told the cowboys to push the cattle and horses onto water and hold them there. Without saying a word, Augustus walked over, took off his clothes, and had a long bath in the little stream. The cowboys holding the herd could see him sitting in the shallow water, now and then splashing some of his long white hair. "Sometimes I think Gus is crazy," Soupy Jones said. "Why is he sitting in the water?" "Maybe he's fishing," Dish Boggett said facetiously. He had no opinion of Soupy Jones, and saw no reason why Gus shouldn't bathe if he wanted to. Augustus came walking back to the wagon with his hair dripping. "It looks like sandy times ahead," he said. "Call, you got too much of the prophet in you. You're always trying to lead us into the deserts." "Well, there's water there," Call said. "I seen it. If we can get them close enough that they can smell it, they'll go. How far do you think a cow can smell water?" "Not no 80 miles, Augustus said. They started the herd 2 hours before sundown, and drove all night through the barren country. The hands had made night drives before, and were glad to be traveling in the cool. Most of them expected, though, that Call would stop for breakfast, but he didn't. He rode ahead of the herd and kept on going. Some of the hands were beginning to feel empty. They kept looking hopefully for a sign that Call might slacken and let Pocampo feed them, but Call didn't slacken. They kept the cattle moving until midday, by which time some of the weaker cattle were already lagging well behind. The leaders were tired and acting fractious. Finally, Call did stop. "We'll rest a little until it starts to get cool," he said. "Then we'll drive all night again. That ought to put us close." He wasn't sure, though. For all their effort, they had covered only some 35 or 40 miles. It would be touch and go. Late that afternoon, while the cowboys were lying around resting, a wind sprang up from the west. From the first, it was as hot as if it were blowing over coals. By the time Call was ready to start the herd again, the wind had risen, and they faced a full-fledged sandstorm. It blew so hard that the cattle were reluctant to face it. Newt, with the Rainey boys, was holding the drags as usual. The wind howled across the flat plain, and the sand seemed to sing as it skimmed the ground. Newt found that looking into the wind blinded him almost instantly. He mostly ducked his head and kept his eyes shut. The horses didn't like the sand either. They began to duck and jump around, irritated at being forced into such a wind. "This is bad luck," Augustus said to Call. He adjusted his bandana over his nose, and he pulled his hat down as far as it would go. "We can't stop here," Call said. "We ain't but halfway to water." "Yes, and some of them will still be halfway when this blows itself out," Augustus said. Call helped Lippy and the cook tie down everything on the wagon. Lippy, who hated wind, looked frightened. Pocampo said nothing. "You better ride tonight," Call said to Pocampo. "If you try to walk, you might get lost." "We all might get lost tonight," Pocampo said. He took an old axe handle that he sometimes used as a cane and walked, but at least he consented to walk right with the wagon. None of the men, no strangers to sandstorms, could remember such a sunset. The sun was like a dying coal, ringed with black long before it neared the horizon. After it set, the rim of the earth was blood-red for a few minutes. Then the red was streaked with black. The afterglow was quickly snuffed out by the sand. Jasper Fant wished for the 1000th time that he had stayed in Texas. Dish Boggett was troubled by the sensation that there was a kind of river of sand flowing above his head. When he looked up in the eerie twilight, he seemed to see it, as if somehow the world had turned over, and the road that ought to be beneath his feet was now over his head. If the wind stopped, he felt, the sand river would fall and bury him. Call told them to keep as close to the cattle as possible, and to keep the cattle moving. Any cattle that wandered far would probably starve to death. Augustus thought the order foolish. The only way to keep this herd together would be to string a rope around them, and we ain't got that much rope, he said. Shortly after dark, he was proven right. None of the animals wanted to go into the wind. It quickly became necessary for the cowboys to cover their horses' eyes with jackets or shirts, and despite the hands' precautions, little strings of cattle began to stray. Newt tried unsuccessfully to turn back 2 bunches, but the cattle paid him no mind, even when he bumped them with his horse. Finally, he let them go, feeling guilty as he did it, but not guilty enough to risk getting lost himself. He knew if he lost the herd, he was probably done for. He knew it was a long way to water, and he might not be able to find it, even though he was riding the good sorrel that Clara had given him. Call felt sick with worry. The sandstorm was the worst possible luck, for it slowed down the herd and sapped the animals' strength just when they needed all they had just to reach the water. And yet there was nothing he could do about it. He tried to tie an old shirt around the hellbitch's eyes, but she shook him off so vigorously that he finally let it go. At the height of the storm, it seemed as if the herd might split into fragments. It was hard to see 10 feet, and little bunches of cattle broke off unnoticed and slipped past the cowboys. Dietz, more confident of his ability to find his way around than most, rode well west of the herd, turning back cattle whenever he found any. But it finally became pitch dark, and even Dietz could do nothing. Augustus rode through the storm with a certain indifference, thinking of the 2 women he had just left. He took no interest in the straying cattle. That was Call's affair. He felt he himself deserved to be in the middle of a sandstorm on the Wyoming plains for being such a fool as to leave the women. Not a man to feel guilty, he was merely annoyed at himself for what he considered a misjudgment. To Call's great relief, the storm blew itself out in 3 hours. The wind gradually died, and the sand lay under their feet again instead of peppering them. The moon was soon visible, and the sky filled with bright stars. It would not be possible to judge how many cattle had strayed until the morning, but at least the main herd was still under their control. But the storm and the long drive the day before had taken its toll in energy. By dawn, half the men were asleep in their saddles. They wanted to stop, but again Call pushed on. He knew they had lost ground, and was not going to stop just because the men were sleepy. All morning he rode through the herd, encouraging the men to push the cattle. He was not sure how far they had come, but he knew they still had a full day to go. Lack of water was beginning to tell on the horses, and the weaker cattle were barely stumbling along. Dietz alone brought back most of the strayed bunches, none of which had strayed very far. The plain was so vast and flat that the cattle were visible for miles, at least to Augustus and Dietz, the eyesight champions. "There's a bunch you missed," Augustus said, pointing to the northwest. Dietz looked, nodded, and rode away. Jasper Fant looked and saw nothing but heat waves and blue sky. "I guess I need spectacles," he said. "I can't see nothing but nothing." "Weak brains breed weak eyesight," Augustus said. "We all got weak brains or we wouldn't be here," Soupy said sourly. He had grown noticeably more discontented in recent weeks. No one knew why. Finally, at noon, Call stopped. The effort to move the drags was wearing out the horses. When the cowboys got to the wagon, most of them took a cup of water and dropped sound asleep on the ground, not bothering with bedrolls or even saddle blankets. Pocampo rationed the water carefully, giving each man only 3 swallows. Newt felt that he could have drunk 1,000 swallows. He had never tasted anything so delicious. He had never supposed plain water could be so desirable. He remembered all the times he had carelessly drunk his fill. If he ever got another chance, he meant to enjoy it more. Call let them rest 3 hours, and then told them to get their best mounts. Some of the cattle were so weak that the cowboys had to dismount. pull their tails and shout at them to get them up. Call knew that if they didn't make it on the next push, they would have to abandon the cattle in order to save the horses. Even after their rest, many of the cattle had their tongues hanging out. They were mulish, reluctant to move, but after much effort on the part of the exhausted men, the drive was started again. Through the late afternoon and far into the night, the cattle stumbled over the plain, the weaker cattle falling farther and farther behind. By daybreak, the herd was strung out to a distance of more than 5 miles, most of the men plodding along as listlessly as the cattle. The day was as hot as any they remembered from South Texas. The distances that had spawned yesterday's wind refused to yield even a breeze, and it seemed to the men that the last moisture in their bodies was pouring out as sweat. They all yearned for evening and looked at the sun constantly, but the sun seemed as immobile as if suspended by a wire. Toward midday, many of the cattle began to turn back toward the water they had left 2 days before. Newt, struggling with a bunch, nearly got knocked off his horse by 3 steers that walked right into him. He noticed, to his shock, that the cattle didn't seem to see him. They were stumbling along, white-eyed. Appalled, he rode over to the captain. "Captain, they're going blind," he said. Call looked grim. "It ain't real blindness," he said. "They get that way when they're real thirsty. They'll try to go back to the last water." He told the men to forget the weaker cattle and try to keep the stronger ones moving. "We ought to make the water by night," he said. "If we make night," Augustus said. "We can't just stop and die," Call said. "I don't intend to," Augustus said, "but some of the men might. That Irishman is delirious. He ain't used to such dry country." Indeed, the terrible heat had driven Allen O'Brien out of his head. Now and then he would try to sing, though his tongue was swollen and his lips cracked. "You don't need to sing," Call said. Allen O'Brien looked at him angrily. "I need to cry, but I've got no tears," he said. "This goddamn country has burned up my tears." Call had been awake for over 3 days, and he began to feel confused himself. He knew water couldn't be much farther, but all the same, fatigue made him doubtful. Perhaps it had been 100 miles rather than 80. They would never make it, if so. He tried to remember, searching his mind for details that would suggest how far the river might be, but there were precious few landmarks on the dry plain, and the harder he concentrated, the more his mind seemed to slip. He was riding the hell-bitch, but for long moments he imagined he was riding old Ben again, a mule he had relied on frequently during his campaigning on the Llano. Ben had had an infallible sense of direction, and a fine nose for water. He wasn't fast, but he was sure. At the time, some men had scoffed at him for riding a mule, but Call ignored them. The stakes were life or death, and Ben was the most reliable animal he had ever seen, if far from the prettiest. The men had had the last of Pocampo's water that morning, barely enough to wet their tongues. Pocampo doled it out with severity, careful to see that no one got more than his share. Though the old man had walked the whole distance using his axe-handle cane, he seemed not particularly tired. Call, though, was so tired he felt his mind slipping. Try as he might, he couldn't stay awake. Once he slept for a few steps, then jerked awake, convinced he was fighting again the Battle of Fort Phantom Hill. He looked around for Indians, but saw only the thirst-blinded cattle, their long tongues hanging out, their breath rasping. His mind slipped again, and when he awoke next, it was dark. The hell-bitch was trotting. When he opened his eyes, he saw the Texas bull trot past him. He reached for his reins, but they were not there. His hands were empty. Then, to his amazement, he saw that Dietz had taken his reins and was leading the hell-bitch. No one had ever led his horse before. Call felt embarrassed. "Here, I'm awake," he said, his voice just a whisper. Dietz stopped and gave him his reins. "Didn't want you to fall and get left, Captain," he said. "The water ain't far now." That was evident from the quickened pace of the cattle, from the way the horses began to prick their ears. Call tried to shake the sleep off, but it was as if he were stuck in it. He could see, but it took a great effort to move, and he wasn't immediately able to resume command. Augustus loped up, seemingly fresh. "We better get everybody to the front," he said. "We'll need to try and spread them when they hit the water. Otherwise they'll all pile into the first mud hole and trample themselves." Most of the cattle were too weak to run, but they broke into a trot. Call finally shook the sleep off and helped Dish and Dietz and Augustus split the herd. They were only partially successful. The cattle were moving like a blind army, the scent of water in their nostrils. Fortunately, they hit the river above where Call had hit it, and there was more water. The cattle spread of their own accord. Call had not recovered from his embarrassment at having been led, yet he knew Dietz had done the right thing. He had still been dreaming of Ben and that hot day at Phantom Hill, and if he had slipped off his horse, he might just have lain there and slept. But it was the first time in his life he had not been able to last through a task in command of his wits, and it bothered him. All during the night and the next day, cattle straggled into the river, some of them cattle Call had supposed would merely become carcasses rotting on the trail. Yet a day on the water worked wonders for them. Augustus and Dish made counts, once the stragglers stopped coming, and it appeared they had only lost 6 head. The Irishman spent most of the day sitting in a puddle in Salt Creek, recovering from his delirium. He could not remember having been delirious, and grew angry when the others kidded him about it. Newt, who had planned to drink all day once he got to water, soon found that he couldn't drink any more. He devoted his leisure to complicated games of mumblety-peg with the Rainey boys. Dietz went on a scout and reported that the country to the west didn't improve. Grass was as scarce as water in that direction. Far to the north, they could see the outlines of mountains, and there was much talk about which mountains they were. "Why, the Rocky Mountains," Augustus said. "Will we have to climb them?" Jasper asked. He had survived rivers and drought, but did not look forward to climbing mountains. "No," Call said, "we'll go north, up the Powder River, right into Montana." "How many days will it take now?" Newt asked. He had almost forgotten that Montana was a real place that they might get to someday. "I expect 3 weeks or a little more, and we might hit the Yellowstone," Call said. "The Yellowstone already?" Dish Boggett said. It was the last river, or at least the last river anyone knew much about. At mention of it, the whole camp fell silent, looking at the mountains. Chapter 90. They rested on the Salt for 2 days, giving the animals and men plenty of time to recover. The men spent much of their time speculating about what lay on beyond the mountains, and how long it would take to get there. Call slept a distance out of camp, as was his habit. He knew the men were in a good mood, for he could hear them singing most of the night. Now that he had the leisure to sleep, he found he couldn't much. He had always thought his energies equal to any situation, but he had begun to have doubts. A tiredness clung to his bones, but not a tiredness that produced sleep. He felt played out and wished they were already in Montana. There were only a few hundred miles left, but it seemed farther to him than all the distance they had come. Trotting back into camp one morning, he saw there was excitement around the cook fire. Several of the men were holding rifles. The sight surprised him, for it had seemed a peaceful night. 12 horses are gone, Captain," Dish Boggett said. "Indians got 'em." Dietz was looking hangdog, and the Spettle boy could only shake his head. Neither of them had heard a thing, they said. "Well, you boys was singing Opry loud enough to wake the deaf," Augustus remarked. "I guess it was just their charity that they didn't take the whole herd. Nobody would have noticed."